People assume grief is loud. They imagine sobbing, screaming, a life visibly shattered. But mine was quiet. It settled into my days like dust, thin and persistent, coating everything without announcing itself. From the outside, my life looked calm, even orderly. I woke up at the same hour every morning, made the bed with crisp corners, brewed 1 cup of coffee instead of 2, and sat by the window as the sun climbed over the neighbor's roof. Nothing dramatic, nothing broken. At least, nothing anyone could see. It had been 3 years since my husband died, and in those 3 years, I had learned how to move through the world carefully. I learned how to smile at the grocery store cashier, how to answer "I'm fine" without my voice cracking, how to keep my hands busy so my thoughts wouldn't wander to places that still hurt too much. Grief, I discovered, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it waits. Our house had become a museum of small habits. His slippers still rested by the door, untouched, as if he might step back into them any day now. His favorite mug sat at the back of the cabinet, never used but never given away. Every object had a place, and every place held a memory. I told myself this was healing. Preservation, not avoidance. Love, not denial. Yet there were moments, late at night, when the silence pressed against my chest, and I wondered whether I was honoring him or hiding behind him. The watch was the one thing I allowed myself to believe was finished. My husband had worn it every day for as long as I'd known him, the leather strap softened by time, the face scratched from years of use. It was never expensive, but it was his. He used to joke that as long as it kept ticking, so would he. When he died suddenly, far too suddenly, I insisted it be buried with him. That was my line in the sand. Some things, I believed, had to stay in the past. Life after him became about balance. I kept the garden neat but not perfect. I cooked enough to nourish myself, not enough to remember how he used to steal bites from the pot. I folded his old sweaters into a box I never opened. This was how I survived, by keeping everything measured, controlled, contained. Emotional stillness became my shield. If I didn't stir the water, nothing painful would rise to the surface. My daughter worried about me, though she tried not to show it. She invited me over often, asked if I was lonely, suggested hobbies, trips, new routines. I always thanked her and declined gently. I didn't want more. Wanting felt dangerous. I had already learned what happened when you built your life around another person and suddenly had to live without them. Stability, even fragile stability, felt safer than hope. On Sundays, I visited the cemetery. I brought fresh flowers and spoke to him quietly, telling him about ordinary things. The weather, the neighbor's dog, the way the roses had bloomed early that year. I never cried there. My tears belonged to private spaces, to nights when the house creaked and the clock felt too loud. At the grave, I was composed, loyal, complete, or at least that's what I told myself. There was comfort in routine, but also danger. I didn't realize how much I depended on predictability until I noticed how tense I became when something changed. A late bus, a moved piece of furniture, an unanswered phone call. My calm life was balanced on a narrow edge, and I guarded it fiercely. I believed that as long as I didn't look too closely, nothing could disturb the fragile peace I had built. People praised my strength. They said I handled widowhood with grace, that I was resilient, that I had found my footing. I accepted their compliments because correcting them felt unnecessary and exhausting. Strength, I learned, is often mistaken for silence. But silence doesn't mean the storm has passed. Sometimes it means it's gathering force, waiting for the right moment to break. Looking back now, I can see how carefully I avoided questions. How I didn't examine the gaps in memory, the moments surrounding my husband's death that felt blurry or rushed. I trusted what I was told because trusting was easier than doubting. Closure, I believed, was a gift you could choose to accept. I took it willingly, never suspecting it might be incomplete. That quiet life, that carefully arranged world of grief and routine, felt permanent. I thought I had already survived the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I had no idea that time, the very thing I believed had healed me was about to betray me. And that something I thought was buried forever was already counting down, tick by steady tick, toward the moment everything would change. I still remember the day he bought the watch. We weren't rich back then, just a young couple trying to make sense of adulthood, but he had this quiet pride when he wrapped it around his wrist for the first time. It wasn't flashy, just simple stainless steel with a soft brown leather strap and a faint scratch near the bezel that caught the light when he moved. He used to say, "It's not about the brand, it's about the time it holds." I laughed at that, but he meant it. To him, time was sacred, something to be respected, not wasted. Every morning, he wound it carefully, a tiny ritual of order before the chaos of the day. I'd be making breakfast, and I could hear the faint click of the crown turning as he set it precisely. The sound was oddly comforting, a heartbeat in the background of our life together. Even on the hardest days, when money was tight, when illness visited, when silence stretched between us longer than we liked, the ticking of that watch never faltered. It was his rhythm, his steadiness, his way of saying we'll get through this. When he died, I couldn't bring myself to look at it at first. The hospital returned it with his wallet, ring, and wedding band sealed in a small plastic bag. That tiny, sterile envelope felt heavier than my body could bear. I remember opening it alone, sitting at the kitchen table with trembling hands, staring at that familiar watch resting lifelessly in my palm. It had stopped at 3:47 p.m., the moment the doctor said his heart gave out. Time, it seemed, had chosen to stop with him. There was no question in my mind about what to do with it. Some people keep jewelry or photographs. I wanted the watch buried with him. It was part of him, a quiet symbol of everything he was, reliable, constant, ordinary in the most extraordinary way. At the funeral, I remember asking the undertaker to place it on his wrist. I stood there, watching as they slipped it under the cuff of his suit, and for a brief second, I thought I saw the second hand twitch. My heart leapt, but it must have been a trick of light, or maybe just my desperate wish that he wasn't truly gone. After that, I closed the casket myself. That was supposed to be the end. In the months that followed, I found comfort in believing that part of him still existed somewhere, 6 feet below, sealed away with that watch. It wasn't morbid to me, it was devotion. Whenever I missed him too much, I would imagine it still ticking quietly in the dark, keeping time for the both of us. I convinced myself that as long as the watch existed, so did something of him. It made the loss easier to carry. Certainty became my coping mechanism. I knew where that watch was. I knew what had happened, and knowing, believing, was what kept me sane. Sometimes my daughter would ask, "Mom, why did you bury it with him? Wouldn't you want something to remember him by?" I'd smile and tell her, "I already have him in my memories. The watch belongs with his time." She didn't understand then, but how could she? She was young, still learning that love doesn't fade when the person does, it just changes shape. My certainty about that watch wasn't about logic, it was about peace. I couldn't handle the thought of holding it every day, seeing it tick while he didn't. That would have been unbearable. There were moments, though quiet ones, when I questioned whether burying it was the right thing to do. On our anniversary, I'd reach for my wrist, almost expecting to feel the weight of it there. Sometimes I'd dream of it. In those dreams, I'd hear the ticking again, faint but steady, echoing through a house that felt both ours and not ours. I'd wake up with tears on my face, the sound fading like a whisper. But when morning came, I'd tell myself dreams were just dreams, and that certainty, like faith, was something you had to choose every day. What I didn't know then was that certainty has a fragile edge. When you lean on it too hard, it cracks, and everything you've built around it starts to crumble. That crack began with something simple, a memory. I was sorting through old boxes one afternoon, putting away some of his letters and photos, when I came across a picture of him wearing the watch. It wasn't the watch itself that caught me off guard, it was the background. A faint reflection in the mirror showed my daughter as a teenager, maybe 17, standing beside him. I realized with a strange jolt that the photo was newer than I thought. It was taken only months before he died. Somehow, that watch had aged with him, changed color slightly, the leather darker, more worn. I remembered thinking it looked like it had absorbed all the years we lived together. It was strange how one object could hold so much. Every scratch, every tiny imperfection had a story. The nick near the bezel from when we moved apartments. The faint crack on the back from when he dropped it while chasing our daughter in the park. The faint oil scent from his hands. He was a mechanic, after all, and even after a shower, the smell of his work lingered. That watch wasn't just an object. It was him distilled into something tangible, solid proof of his life. That's why I was certain, absolutely certain, it had gone into the ground with him. I had seen it myself. In a way, that certainty became a shield. I used it to fend off doubt, to keep my mind from wandering into darker thoughts. Because if I allowed myself to question that, then what else could I trust? The doctor's words, the timeline of his death, my own memory. No, the watch was sacred ground. It was the line I would never cross. I often think now that closure is an illusion we construct when reality feels too unstable. We convince ourselves the story is finished, the book closed, the last word written. But time, like love, doesn't obey our rules. It moves in ways we can't predict, folding back on itself, reviving what we thought was gone. I learned that too late. Back then, though, I clung to the belief that everything was settled. The watch, the grave, the silence, all parts of a completed story. It was comforting to imagine it resting there, undisturbed beneath the earth. I would visit his grave, place my hand on the cool stone, and whisper, "Keep time for me just a little longer." I never imagined that the rhythm I once associated with love and constancy would one day return not as comfort, but as a question, one that would tear through every layer of certainty I had built. Because nothing could have prepared me for the day I heard that same ticking sound again. Alive, impossible, coming from somewhere it could never be. And that's where everything I believed began to unravel. It happened on a day so ordinary that I would have forgotten it entirely if not for what followed. No warning, no strange feeling in my chest, just a quiet afternoon wrapped in routine, the kind I trusted. I had gone to my daughter's house to help her organize the spare room, the one that had slowly turned into a place where unused things went to disappear. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and laundry detergent, familiar and safe. My grandson was napping. The television murmured softly in the living room. Everything was normal, too normal. I remember thinking how grateful I was for that normalcy. After years of grief, stability felt like a gift. My daughter chatted casually as she folded clothes, complaining about how little storage space they had. Her husband was at work, as he usually was during the day. There was nothing secretive about the moment, nothing dramatic. Just a mother helping her daughter, passing time, filling silence with small talk. Trust lived easily in that space. It always had. At some point, she asked if I could check one of the drawers in the dresser for extra sheets. I knelt down, my knees protesting slightly, and pulled open the bottom drawer. The sound came before I fully registered what I was seeing. A soft, rhythmic ticking. Steady, mechanical, familiar in a way that made my breath catch before my mind could catch up. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Grief has a way of playing tricks, of resurrecting sounds you've lost. I froze, my hand still resting on the drawer, afraid that if I moved, the sound would disappear. The ticking continued. For a brief, irrational moment, I told myself it was something else. A toy, a clock from another room, anything but what my body already knew. My heart began to pound, not fast but heavy, as if each beat was asking a question I didn't want to answer. I leaned closer, the smell of wood and fabric filling my nose, and pushed aside a stack of folded t-shirts. That's when I saw it. The watch. It lay there carelessly, half hidden beneath fabric, its leather strap slightly curled, the face angled just enough for the light to catch it. The second hand moved with quiet confidence, ticking forward like it always had, like it never stopped. I felt dizzy. My hands went cold. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of my vision blurring as my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. I had watched that watch go into the ground. I had closed the casket. I knew. I didn't touch it at first. I couldn't. The space between us felt charged, dangerous. My thoughts raced, colliding into each other. How, why, when? Each question echoed louder than the last. I remember thinking that if I picked it up, something irreversible would happen. That this moment, suspended in disbelief, was the last place where my world still made sense. The ticking grew louder in my ears, though I knew it hadn't changed. It was my perception that was unraveling. My daughter's voice floated in from behind me, casual and unaware. "Did you find them?" she asked. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, and forced myself to answer. "Not yet," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. The contrast between how calm I appeared and how violently my insides were shaking made me feel unreal, like I was watching myself from somewhere outside my body. I slid the drawer shut slowly, the ticking muffled but not gone, as if the watch was mocking my attempt to deny it. I stood up carefully, afraid my legs would give out. My daughter smiled at me, completely unaware that something fundamental had just broken. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her shoulders and demand an explanation she didn't even know she needed to give. But I didn't. Trust held me back, or maybe fear did. The idea that this could be a misunderstanding felt safer than the alternative, because if it wasn't, then everything I believed about my family, about my husband's death, was wrong. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me as soon as I was inside. I gripped the edge of the sink and stared at my reflection. My face looked pale, older somehow. "You're mistaken," I whispered to myself. "It's not the same watch." But I knew that wasn't true. I could picture every detail without looking. The scratch near the bezel, the way the strap bent, the quiet, relentless ticking. Memory and reality collided, and for the first time since my husband's death, memory lost. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to ground myself. The sound of the water was too loud, too sharp, as if the world was suddenly turned up a notch. I took deep breaths, counting them the way therapists had taught me years ago. 1, 2, 3. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of that watch refused to fade. It sat in my mind like a warning, like proof that something was deeply wrong. When I returned to the room, my daughter was still folding, still smiling, still trusting. I watched her hands move, her wedding ring catching the light, and felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with dread. If the watch was real, and I knew it was, then someone had put it there. Someone had taken it. The unthinkable crept closer with every second. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, not to let suspicion poison what remained of my family. But doubt had already planted itself firmly in my chest. The rest of the visit passed in a blur. I laughed when expected, nodded at the right moments, and avoided the dresser like it was radioactive. The ticking echoed in my mind the entire time, growing louder with each passing minute. When I finally left, hugging my daughter goodbye, I felt like I was leaving a version of myself behind, the woman who believed in simple explanations and permanent closure. As I drove home, my hands shook on the steering wheel. Questions crowded my thoughts, each one darker than the last. Had I imagined it? No. Had someone moved the watch before the burial? Impossible. Had it been replaced? By whom? And why? Trust and disbelief wrestled violently inside me, neither willing to let go. I wanted answers, but I was terrified of what those answers might cost me. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the drawer opening again, heard the ticking again, felt the world tilt again. The ordinary had been shattered by the impossible, and there was no going back. Something I had buried, literally and emotionally, had returned, demanding to be seen. And as the seconds passed, I realized with growing certainty that the ticking wasn't just marking time. It was counting down to a truth I wasn't ready to face, but no longer able to avoid. For days after that visit, I said nothing. Not to my daughter, not to my friends, not even to myself, not really. Silence became my refuge, the place where the impossible could be kept at bay. I moved through my routines with mechanical precision, as if normalcy could overwrite what I had seen. I washed dishes, watered plants, folded laundry that didn't need folding. Each small task was a shield against the truth waiting just beneath the surface. At night, denial tried to comfort me. It whispered that grief distorts memory, that trauma rearranges facts to suit our fears. I told myself maybe it wasn't his watch. Maybe it only looked like it. Maybe the ticking I heard was something else entirely, a sound my mind borrowed from the past and placed in the present. The human brain, after all, is fragile. I had read that somewhere. I clung to that idea like a lifeline. But denial is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance, a steady supply of excuses to keep doubt from creeping in. Every time I closed my eyes, the image returned with brutal clarity. The watch hadn't been vague or distant. It had been precise. Real, the scratch, the strap. The way the second hand moved without hesitation, confident in its purpose. My heart knew before my mind was willing to admit it. I hadn't imagined it. Fear followed close behind. Not the sharp, panicked kind, but a slow, creeping dread that settled into my bones. Fear of being wrong, fear of being right, fear of what would happen if I spoke, and fear of what would happen if I didn't. Confrontation loomed like a cliff edge. One step forward and everything could fall apart. Silence, on the other hand, promised temporary safety, or so I told myself. I replayed the moment over and over, dissecting it from every angle. I questioned my own senses. Had the light been poor? Had I been tired? Had my grief finally caught up with me after years of suppression? I even stood in front of the mirror one morning and asked myself out loud, "Are you losing your mind?" The woman staring back looked tired but sane. That answer brought no relief. The hardest part wasn't the fear itself. It was the loneliness of carrying it alone. I had spent years teaching myself to endure pain quietly, believing that strength meant not burdening others. Now that habit turned against me. Each unspoken thought grew heavier, pressing on my chest until breathing felt like work. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but the words refused to form. Once spoken, they would demand answers, and answers terrified me. I thought about my daughter constantly, about her smile, her trust, the way she believed her family was solid and safe. What right did I have to disrupt that? What if I was wrong? Accusing without proof would poison everything. Yet what if I was right? What did it say about me if I stayed silent then? Fear and courage pulled me in opposite directions, tearing at my sense of self. At times, anger surfaced, sharp and unexpected. Anger at myself for doubting my own experience. Anger at my husband for leaving me with unanswered questions. Anger at the universe for demanding strength when I felt weakest. But anger, too, was easier to manage in silence. It burned quietly, contained, never spilling into the world where it could do real damage. I tried to reason my way out of the truth. I made lists in my head of plausible explanations, even improbable ones. Perhaps the watch had been misplaced before the burial. Perhaps someone had switched it without my knowledge. Perhaps time had played a cruel trick on my memory. Each explanation felt flimsy, collapsing under the weight of what I remembered so clearly. Still, I clung to them. Letting go meant facing something far worse. Sleep abandoned me. Nights stretched endlessly, the ticking sound echoing in my imagination like a taunt. In the dark, courage felt impossible. The idea of asking questions, of opening that drawer again, made my stomach twist. Daylight brought no comfort either. With each passing hour, the silence I maintained grew louder, screaming its presence through my thoughts. There were moments when I almost spoke. A phone in my hand, my daughter's name glowing on the screen. My mouth opened, words hovering on the edge of escape. Then fear would tighten its grip. What would I say? "I think I saw your father's watch in your house." The sentence sounded absurd, accusatory, dangerous. I lowered the phone every time, ashamed of my own hesitation. I began to realize that silence wasn't neutral. It was a choice. By choosing not to act, I was choosing to live with doubt. Yet action carried consequences I wasn't prepared to face. I stood frozen between two futures, neither of them safe. One promised truth at an unknown cost. The other offered temporary peace built on uncertainty. I didn't know which required more courage. In quiet moments, I wondered if this was a test of integrity. A moment when life asks who you really are beneath routine and restraint. Was I someone who protected comfort at all costs, or someone who honored truth no matter how painful? The answer shifted depending on the hour, my strength rising and falling like a tide I couldn't control. By the end of that week, I understood one thing clearly. Silence could not last forever. Denial cracks under pressure. Fear grows hungry when fed, and truth, once seen, does not unsee itself. I hadn't confronted anyone yet, but the confrontation had already begun, inside me. And as I stood at the edge of that inner battle, I sensed that the longer I waited, the less control I would have over how, and when the truth finally demanded to be heard. When I thought of my son-in-law before that day, the word that came to mind was reliable. He was the kind of man who shook hands firmly, who showed up on time, who fixed things without being asked. He had helped me after my husband's funeral, carrying boxes, repairing a loose step on my porch, insisting I sit while he worked. Back then, his kindness felt like proof that my daughter had chosen well. Family loyalty wrapped around him naturally, comfortably. I never questioned it. But once doubt enters your life, it has a way of rewriting the past. After the discovery, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not in a dramatic way at first, just small, nagging thoughts that slipped into my mind uninvited. I began replaying old conversations, searching for something I might have missed. A tone, a look, a hesitation. At first, I found nothing. He had always been polite, respectful, almost careful around me. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it unsettled me. I remembered how he reacted when my husband died. He was calm, supportive. He hugged my daughter tightly and told her everything would be okay. He didn't cry, but not everyone does. I had admired his strength then, the way he seemed to anchor her when everything else was falling apart. Now I wondered whether that steadiness came from control rather than compassion. The thought made my stomach tighten. Memories shifted subtly, like shadows stretching at dusk. I recalled moments when he seemed overly interested in practical details after the death, asking about paperwork, about hospital procedures, about what belongings had been returned. At the time, I assumed he was being helpful, stepping in where I was too numb to function. Now those same questions echoed differently. Curiosity turned into scrutiny, helpfulness into something harder to define. I hated myself for thinking this way. This man was family. He was the father of my grandson. Suspecting him felt like betrayal, a violation of the trust I had extended without hesitation for years. I told myself I was being unfair, that grief and shock were distorting my perspective. Yet every attempt to dismiss the thoughts only seemed to sharpen them. Trust, once cracked, does not mend easily. I started noticing small things I had never paid attention to before. How his smile sometimes stopped short of his eyes. How he listened more than he spoke, as if measuring his words carefully. How he always seemed to know more than he shared. None of this was proof of anything, and that was what frightened me most. Suspicion thrives in ambiguity. It feeds on the absence of clear answers. One afternoon, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, stopping on pictures where he appeared in the background. At birthdays, at holidays, standing slightly apart, arms crossed, watching. Was that just his personality, or had it always been something else? The question felt cruel, but I couldn't stop asking it. Kind appearances, I was learning, could coexist with hidden motives. The realization chipped away at my sense of safety. I thought about the watch again, about how it could have ended up in his drawer. The logic looped endlessly in my mind. He had access to the house. He had been present during those chaotic days after the death. He knew where things were kept. Each fact by itself meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't want to see. My loyalty to my family battled fiercely against the emerging distrust, neither willing to give ground. The most disturbing part was how normal he continued to seem. When I saw him again at a family dinner, he laughed easily, asked about my health, passed the bread without hesitation. I studied his hands as he moved, half expecting to see guilt written there. I saw nothing. That absence felt louder than any confession. If he was hiding something, he was doing it well. And that scared me more than open hostility ever could. I began questioning my own instincts. Had I always been this blind? Or was I inventing danger where none existed? I reminded myself that people are complex, that no one is entirely good or bad. But the watch loomed over every thought, a physical contradiction that refused to be ignored. Objects don't lie. People do. The simplicity of that idea felt brutal. Late at night, I imagined confronting him, watching his face for a flicker of recognition or fear. In those imagined conversations, the outcome shifted constantly. Sometimes he denied everything calmly. Sometimes he exploded in anger. Sometimes he looked relieved, as if he had been waiting to be discovered. Each version left me feeling hollow. The truth, whatever it was, would change everything. What hurt most was the erosion of warmth I once felt around him. Family gatherings now carried an undercurrent of tension I couldn't explain to anyone else. I laughed less, spoke less, observed more. I hated the person I was becoming, suspicious, guarded, distant. But once trust begins to dissolve, you can't simply decide to restore it. It leaks away slowly, leaving behind unease. I wondered whether he sensed my change. If he noticed the way my eyes lingered on him longer than before, the way my answers became shorter. If he did, he gave no sign. That composure only deepened my unease. The contrast between his calm exterior and the storm growing inside me became unbearable. Appearances, I realized, are often designed to disarm. By then, my shock had fully transformed into something colder. Unease settled into my bones, replacing disbelief with wary attention. I no longer asked whether the watch was real. I asked why it was there. And more frighteningly, what else I didn't know. The story I thought I understood was unraveling thread by thread, and at the center of it stood a man I had once trusted without question. I still loved my family. That hadn't changed. But love, I learned, does not protect you from doubt. Sometimes it sharpens it. And as I watched my son-in-law move through the familiar rhythms of our shared life, I understood that the danger wasn't just in what he might have done. It was in what I was now forced to see. The shadows had shifted, and once seen, they could not be unseen. Once suspicion takes root, it demands nourishment. Silence no longer soothed me the way it once had. Instead, it pressed me toward the past, urging me to look again at what I had deliberately blurred. I didn't call it investigating at first. That sounded dramatic, accusatory. I told myself I was simply remembering, revisiting, making peace. But deep down, I knew I was searching for something I had missed. I started with the day my husband died. I had replayed it countless times over the years, but always in fragments. His smile that morning, the way he kissed my forehead, the unfinished cup of coffee on the counter. I focused on the gentle details, the safe ones. Now, for the first time, I forced myself to look at the entire timeline, not as a grieving wife, but as a witness questioning her own testimony. He collapsed at work, they said. Sudden, unexpected. A coworker called the ambulance. By the time I reached the hospital, it was already over. That had always been the official truth. Clean, efficient, final. I remembered standing in that cold hallway, clutching my purse while a doctor explained what had happened in practiced, careful words. I had nodded, accepted, signed forms without reading them. Grief had numbed me into obedience. But now, details I once dismissed began to itch. Why hadn't I been allowed to see him right away? Why did the timeline feel rushed, compressed, as if events had been folded over themselves? I pulled out the old folder where I kept hospital papers, death certificates, insurance documents, things I hadn't touched in years. My hands shook as I spread them across the dining table, the paper smelling faintly of dust and age. Dates, times, signatures, they all lined up neatly. Too neatly. I traced the times with my finger. Admission, cardiac arrest, time of death. I remembered the nurse who spoke to me softly, avoiding eye contact. At the time, I thought she was being kind. Now I wondered if she was being careful. The thought made my chest tighten. Official truth has a way of sounding complete, even when it leaves things out. My intuition stirred uneasily. It didn't shout accusations. It whispered questions. I went back through old messages on my phone, scrolling past years of silence until I found the ones from that day. Missed calls. Voicemails I had listened to only once and never again. I played one from a coworker, his voice strained, apologetic. "There was nothing we could do," he said. Nothing we could do. I had accepted that sentence as fact. Now it felt rehearsed. Grief had blurred my memories back then, softened edges I didn't want to cut myself on. But grief fades unevenly. Some parts dull, others sharpen. As I listened again, my awareness felt painfully clear. I noticed pauses, hesitations, things unsaid. My heart pounded as if it recognized something my mind was only beginning to grasp. I visited the hospital one afternoon under the pretense of requesting copies of records. The building looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating, but the smell, antiseptic and recycled air, sent me straight back to that hallway. For a moment, I almost turned around. Fear tugged at me, urging retreat, but courage, quiet and stubborn, pushed me forward. The clerk behind the desk was polite, efficient. She asked for identification, forms, signatures, everything official, everything controlled. As she typed, I studied her face, wondering how many stories like mine passed through her hands every day. When she handed me the copies, I thanked her and walked out, my legs heavy, my thoughts racing. I had what I asked for. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find. At home, I read through the reports slowly, carefully. Medical language blurred into something almost incomprehensible, but patterns emerged. Tests not performed. Notes that felt vague. Phrases like likely cause and presumed event. Likely, presumed. Those words unsettled me more than outright certainty ever could. They suggested room for doubt where I had believed none existed. Flashbacks came uninvited. My husband lying in bed the night before, complaining of fatigue but brushing it off. Me telling him to rest, promising we'd talk in the morning. The watch on his wrist, ticking steadily as he slept. I had trusted time then, trusted tomorrow. That trust felt naive now, fragile in hindsight. I thought about the days after his death, the people who surrounded me, the help that arrived quickly, efficiently. My son-in-law had been there constantly, handling phone calls, offering to take care of details. At the time, I was grateful beyond words. Now I wondered if my gratitude had blinded me. Had I surrendered responsibility too easily? Had I allowed others to shape the narrative while I was too broken to question it? The realization hurt more than suspicion ever could. It forced me to confront my own vulnerability, weakness versus strength. I had believed I was being strong by letting go, by trusting. Now strength demanded something else entirely: attention, skepticism, courage. I began keeping notes, writing down questions as they came to me. Why did the watch stop at that exact time? Why was it returned so quickly? Why did I never see it again before the funeral? Each question led to another, branching endlessly, offering no clear answers. The absence of answers became its own kind of evidence. At night, I lay awake replaying conversations, faces, moments. The way my son-in-law had spoken on the phone after the hospital call. Calm, controlled. The way he reassured my daughter before anyone else had even confirmed what happened. Had that struck me as odd at the time? Or had grief rewritten it into something acceptable? Memory, I realized, is not fixed. It bends under pressure, reshaped by what we need to survive. Still, intuition refused to be silenced. It pressed against the official story, testing its seams. The more I examined the past, the less solid it felt. What I once accepted without question now appeared fragile, dependent on my earlier compliance. Truth, I was learning, often survives only because no one looks too closely. By the end of that week, I was exhausted. Not from answers, I had none, but from questions multiplying faster than I could contain them. The past no longer felt settled. It felt alive, restless, demanding acknowledgement. My grief had once blurred my vision, softened reality to something I could endure. Now awareness sharpened everything, cutting through illusions I had relied on. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I was uncovering. I only knew that I could no longer pretend the past was finished. It was. It was reaching forward, tugging at the present, insisting on being re-examined. And with every unanswered question, the stakes grew higher. Because the more I uncovered, the more I understood that the truth, whatever it was, had been waiting patiently for me to be ready to see it. I didn't realize how heavy a truth could feel until I stood beneath its weight, unsure whether lifting it would crush everything I loved. The evidence I had gathered didn't scream guilt, but it whispered insistently, refusing to fade. Each unanswered question pressed against me, demanding resolution. Yet every step closer to clarity pulled me further from peace. I wasn't choosing between right and wrong anymore. I was choosing between two kinds of pain, and both promised permanent consequences. My daughter became the center of that conflict. Every time I thought about speaking up, her face rose before me, soft, trusting, unaware. She had built her life carefully, brick by brick, believing in the stability of her marriage, the safety of her home. What right did I have to destabilize that? Love urged protection. Silence offered preservation. But silence also felt like complicity, a quiet betrayal of my own integrity. At night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the documents spread before me. Papers don't cry. They don't beg you to stop. They don't remind you of birthdays and laughter and shared meals. They simply exist, indifferent to the damage their meaning might cause. I imagined sliding them back into their folder, closing the drawer, pretending none of it mattered. Peace, fragile as it was, tempted me with its simplicity. But peace built on doubt is restless. It hums beneath the surface, never letting you fully rest. I felt it in my chest, a tightness that refused to loosen. Even when I laughed with my family, a part of me remained distant, guarded. Truth had already changed me. Whether I acted or not, innocence was gone. That realization frightened me more than confrontation ever could. I asked myself what my husband would have wanted. He valued honesty, sometimes to a fault. He believed lies corroded from the inside, slowly eating away at trust. Remembering that made my chest ache. Was honoring him worth risking everything else? Or was my responsibility now to the living, not the dead? Loyalty pulled me backward while integrity pushed me forward, neither willing to yield. I imagined the moment of exposure in vivid detail. My daughter's confusion, her pain, the way her world would tilt, just as mine had. I feared becoming the cause of her suffering, feared being remembered not as a protector, but as the one who shattered her certainty. Yet another voice inside me asked what kind of protection required deception. Was shielding her from truth truly kindness, or was it fear disguised as love? Some mornings, courage felt possible. I rehearsed conversations, practiced calm explanations, convinced myself honesty could be delivered gently. Other days, fear dominated. My hands shook at the thought of confrontation. The risk felt unbearable. Truth promised clarity, but also chaos. Silence promised stability, but demanded sacrifice. I stood between them, paralyzed, feeling weaker with every delay. Friends noticed my distraction. They asked if I was unwell. I smiled and said I was tired. It was easier than admitting I was carrying a moral weight I couldn't set down. No one teaches you how to choose when every option hurts. There are no guides for moments when love and truth demand opposite loyalties. You're left alone with your conscience, hoping it doesn't fail you. I tried to imagine living the rest of my life without answers, growing old with doubt as my constant companion. Would I regret staying silent, or would I regret speaking up more? Regret, I realized, was inevitable. The only question was which regret I could live with. That thought narrowed my choices, even as it intensified the pain of making one. The watch haunted me. Its steady ticking felt like a verdict, counting down my indecision. Time, once my comfort, had become my adversary. Each day I delayed felt like another compromise, another step away from who I believed myself to be. Integrity is quiet until tested. Then it demands everything. I wasn't sure I was strong enough to pay that price. I looked at my grandson one afternoon as he slept, peaceful and unaware. His future stretched out before him, shaped by the choices we made now. Did truth protect him, or did silence? I couldn't be sure, but I knew lies have a way of resurfacing, often at the worst possible moment. Protecting the present at the expense of the future felt reckless. Eventually, the question stopped being theoretical. It became personal. Who was I willing to become to keep the peace? Someone who looked away, someone who ignored her own instincts. The thought hollowed me out. I had survived loss. I had endured grief. Could I survive living against my own values? That, I realized, was the real test. The pressure built until it felt unbearable. My heart raced constantly, my thoughts looping endlessly. I understood then that this conflict would not resolve itself. Inaction was still a decision, and one I would have to own. Truth and peace stood before me like diverging paths, each marked with warning signs. I took a breath, knowing whatever I chose would define me. I hadn't spoken yet. I hadn't confronted anyone, but the decision was forming, slowly, painfully, inside me. The cost of honesty loomed large, but so did the cost of silence. And as I stood on that threshold, I knew that soon, very soon, I would have to choose which kind of loss I was willing to endure. I chose an ordinary moment to confront him, because extraordinary ones felt too dangerous. No raised voices, no witnesses, no dramatic entrances. Just a quiet evening at my daughter's house when she stepped outside to take a phone call and left us alone at the kitchen table. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching thin. Power, I realized, doesn't always belong to the one who speaks first. Sometimes it belongs to the one who finally refuses to stay silent. He looked up at me with that familiar, polite expression, the one I had trusted for years. "Everything okay?" he asked. His voice was calm, controlled. That control almost made me turn back. Almost. "I need to ask you something," I said. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. It sounded steadier than I felt. Vulnerability sat heavy in my chest, but I pushed forward, knowing if I stopped now, I might never start again. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "Sure," he said. "What's going on?" I took a breath. The room felt smaller, the air thick. "I was helping clean the spare room the other day," I began. "I opened a drawer." I paused, watching his face closely. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, too fast to name, too quick to ignore. I heard a watch ticking. Silence stretched between us. Control versus collapse hovered in that space, fragile and waiting. "What kind of watch?" he asked casually, but his jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. "My husband," I said quietly, "the one that was buried with him." For a moment he said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, surprised sound. "That's impossible," he said. "You must be mistaken." The denial came easily, too easily. It slid into place like a practiced response. I felt a surge of anger, sharp and grounding. "I wasn't mistaken," I said. "I saw it, I heard it. It was in your drawer." His smile faded. He uncrossed his arms, leaning forward now. "You've been through a lot," he said gently. "Grief can do strange things to memory." There it was, the subtle shift, the attempt to reclaim power by questioning my sanity, control wrapped in concern. I felt my vulnerability harden into resolve. "Don't do that," I said. "Don't make this about my grief." His eyes darkened. "Then what are you accusing me of?" he asked. The question hung heavy. Accusation meant consequences. I swallowed hard. "I'm asking how that watch ended up in your possession," I said, "because I watched it go into the ground." He stood up abruptly, packing a few steps away. His movements were restless now, less controlled. "You don't know what you saw," he said. "Things get mixed up. People switch items at funerals all the time." "That didn't happen," I said. "I was there, I closed the casket." He stopped packing and looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. The kindness I once believed in his eyes was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Calculation, fatigue, maybe guilt. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why now?" The question stung. It implied intent where there was only necessity. "Because I can't unsee it," I said, "and because you owe me an answer." He exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. For a moment I thought he might confess everything. That hope shattered quickly. "Fine," he said. "You want the truth, I found the watch." My heart lurched. "When?" "After he died," he said. "Before the funeral." My breath caught. "Where?" "At the hospital," he replied. "It was in a bag with his things. I didn't know you wanted it buried with him." "That's not true," I said. "I asked for it specifically." He shrugged. "Things were chaotic, mistakes happen." The partial confession felt worse than a full denial. It cracked something open without revealing what lay beneath. "So you took it?" I asked. "I held on to it," he said sharply. "I didn't steal it." "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice broke then, vulnerability finally surfacing. "Why let me believe it was gone forever?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation his control wavered. "You were fragile," he said. "I thought it would upset you." "Upset me," I whispered. "You let me grieve something I believed was buried with him." His frustration flared. "I was trying to protect everyone." "By lying?" I asked. "By hiding it in your drawer?" He looked away. "I didn't plan to keep it forever." The room felt unsteady, like it might tilt again. "Then why was it still ticking?" I asked. "Why was it still there?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "Because once I had it, I didn't know how to give it back." That admission landed heavily. Power shifted. Control slipped. I saw fear in him now, raw and unpolished. "You let me believe my husband's final resting place was complete when it wasn't," I said. "Do you understand what that did to me?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, voice strained. "I thought time would take care of it." "Time," the word burned. "Time doesn't erase lies," I said. "It exposes them." He sank back into his chair, shoulders slumping. Collapse replaced control. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. The question echoed the one I'd been asking myself for weeks. What did I want? Justice? Truth? An apology that could never be enough? I felt strangely empty. "I want to know if there's anything else you're hiding," I said. "Because if there is, I deserve to know." He was silent for a long moment, then he shook his head. "That's it," he said. "I swear." I searched his face, knowing I might never be certain. Truth had surfaced, but incompletely, distorted by fear and self-preservation. My daughter's voice drifted in from outside, unaware that the foundation beneath her life had cracked. "I need the watch back," I said finally. He nodded. "Of course." As he stood to retrieve it, I realized something painful and clarifying. The confrontation hadn't given me closure. It had given me clarity. Power and vulnerability had traded places, but the damage was done. Control had collapsed, leaving behind consequences neither of us could undo. When he placed the watch in my hand moments later, it felt heavier than ever. It was no longer just a symbol of love. It was proof. Proof that truth, once disturbed, refuses to stay buried. And as the ticking filled the room again, I knew this confrontation was not the end. It was the fracture that would force everything else to finally fall into place. The truth never arrives alone. It brings consequences with it, trailing behind like debris after a storm. I felt that weight the moment I left my daughter's house with the watch clutched in my coat pocket, its ticking pressing against my palm like a pulse that wasn't mine. I had what I asked for: clarity, proof, confirmation, but nothing felt resolved. Instead, everything felt altered, as if the world had shifted slightly off-center and would never quite realign. Telling my daughter was the hardest thing I have ever done. I waited 2 days, giving myself time to breathe, to think, to hope that maybe I wouldn't have to. But hope was no longer an option I could afford. When I finally asked her to come over, my voice shook despite my best efforts. She arrived smiling, unaware, trusting me the way only a child trusts a parent. That trust nearly broke me before I said a word. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize. I told her what I saw, what I asked, what he admitted. Each sentence felt like tearing fabric, irreversible once ripped. Her expression shifted slowly, from confusion to disbelief to a pain so sharp I had to look away. She didn't cry at first. She just sat there, very still, absorbing the destruction of the life she thought she understood. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. "Why would he do that?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. That was the cruelest part. Truth doesn't always explain itself. Sometimes it simply stands there, undeniable and incomplete. I told her I didn't know. That honesty felt both necessary and useless. The days that followed were a blur of tension and quiet devastation. Her marriage fractured under the weight of what had been revealed. Conversations turned into arguments, then into silences so thick they felt physical. Trust, once broken, doesn't shatter cleanly. It splinters, leaving sharp edges everywhere. I watched my daughter struggle between anger and denial, love and betrayal. It was unbearable to witness, knowing I had set this in motion. And yet, beneath the guilt, there was something else. Relief. I hated myself for feeling it, but it was there all the same. The constant knot in my chest loosened. The doubt that had haunted me finally had a shape, a name. Loss and liberation intertwined, inseparable. I had lost the illusion of safety, but I had gained truth. That exchange came at a devastating cost. My relationship with my son-in-law changed irrevocably. We were polite, distant, bound now by obligation rather than trust. He avoided my eyes. I avoided his presence. Whatever control he once held was gone, replaced by defensiveness and quiet resentment. Power had shifted, but no one felt victorious. The clarity I sought had destroyed the easy familiarity we once shared. I questioned myself constantly. Had I done the right thing? Was truth worth this much damage? Watching my daughter grieve the betrayal of her marriage reopened my own grief, layered and raw. Sometimes I wondered if silence would have been kinder. But then I remembered the nights of doubt, the relentless ticking in my mind, the way truth demanded to be seen. Living with clarity hurt, but living with lies had been unbearable. The watch became something different in my hands. No longer just a symbol of love or betrayal, it was a marker of survival. I placed it on my nightstand, listening to its steady rhythm as I fell asleep. For the first time in years, the sound didn't haunt me. It grounded me. Time hadn't stopped with my husband's death. It had kept moving, carrying consequences with it. My sense of reality shifted as well. I realized how easily narratives are constructed, how willingly we accept them when we're vulnerable. That awareness was unsettling but empowering. I saw my own strength more clearly, not in my silence, but in my willingness to face what frightened me most. Weakness had once meant questioning. Now I understood that strength often begins there. Months passed. The immediate fallout softened into something quieter, but the changes remained. My daughter found her footing slowly, painfully. Our bond, strained by the truth, eventually deepened. Honesty, I learned, can wound, but it can also rebuild on firmer ground. Trust would never be the same, but it was no longer blind. I still mourn what was lost, the simplicity, the assumptions, the belief that some things remain untouched. But I don't regret seeking the truth. Destruction cleared the way for clarity, and clarity, however painful, allowed healing to begin. I had chosen integrity over comfort, and while the price was high, it was real. The fallout reshaped my world, but it didn't end it. I learned that truth is not an ending, it's a beginning disguised as loss. And as the ticking watch reminded me each day, time doesn't erase what happened. It carries us forward, asking us to live honestly with what we now know. The storm had passed, but its marks remained, etched into every relationship, every memory. And in that altered landscape, I began slowly to find my way again. I used to think survival meant holding on, that if I kept everything in place, the memories, the routines, the silence, I could preserve what I'd lost. But survival, I've learned, isn't about keeping things unchanged. It's about allowing them to change without losing yourself in the process. Months have passed since that day of confrontation. The chaos has quieted, though the echoes remain. My daughter and I are still rebuilding, carefully, like people learning to trust the ground beneath their feet again. Some days are good, some are brittle. But there's honesty between us now, and that feels like solid ground, even when it hurts. The watch sits on my bedside table. I used to fear its ticking. It sounded like accusation, like time mocking me for what I didn't know. Now I hear something different. Its rhythm no longer belongs to my husband or my son-in-law. It belongs to me. Every tick is proof that I kept going, that time didn't stop with loss or lies or betrayal. It's the sound of survival disguised as routine. There are still moments when grief slips back in quietly, uninvited. I'll catch myself reaching for the second cup of coffee I no longer pour or looking toward the door at the sound of footsteps that will never be his. But instead of collapsing under those moments, I let them pass through me. Pain has changed its shape. It no longer anchors me. It reminds me I'm alive. I often think about truth now, what it demands and what it gives in return. It cost me comfort, yes, and it reshaped the family I once thought unbreakable. But it also gave me something I hadn't realized I'd lost, my integrity. The ability to look at myself in the mirror without flinching. To know that even when silence seemed safer, I chose honesty. That choice didn't fix everything, but it freed me from pretending. When I visit my husband's grave these days, I don't bring flowers as often. Instead, I bring quiet. I sit, listen to the breeze, and tell him what's changed. Sometimes I imagine he's proud of me. Other times, I think he'd tell me the same thing he always did: do what's right, even when it's hard. I used to think strength meant not breaking. Now I know it means breaking and rebuilding anyway. My daughter has grown stronger too. The pain she went through carved space for clarity in her. She sees her life differently now, not as something that fell apart, but as something she's actively shaping. Watching her reclaim her strength has been its own kind of healing. I realize now that protecting her from truth would have denied her the chance to find that strength at all. The house feels different these days, lighter somehow. Not because the pain is gone, but because it's honest. There are no hidden drawers, no ticking secrets. Everything breathes freely again. I keep the watch wound, not because I need it to tell time, but because I like knowing it still moves forward. Like me. Sometimes I sit by the window in the morning, coffee in hand, and listen to its steady beat. I think about how something that once symbolized death and deception has become a reminder of endurance. Time didn't betray me after all. It waited, patiently, for me to catch up. I don't pretend everything has a clean resolution. Life rarely does. Trust, once broken, never returns unchanged. It comes back quieter, more deliberate, less willing to be blind. But maybe that's not a loss. Maybe that's wisdom. The world hasn't returned to what it was before, but I have learned how to live in what remains. There's peace in that. Not the false peace of denial, but the kind that grows from surviving what should have destroyed you. It's smaller, humbler, but real. And in that quiet, the ticking of the watch no longer sounds like a countdown. It sounds like continuity. As the days unfold, I don't look for meaning in everything that happened. I let it exist as it is, painful, imperfect, true. I understand now that truth doesn't promise happiness, it promises freedom. And freedom, once earned, is worth every scar. When I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it, the faint, steady rhythm of the watch by my bed. It's not my husband's heartbeat anymore. It's mine. Time moves forward. So do I.